The problem of finding a good game master for role-playing games is almost as old as role-playing itself. I would say it's virtually as old, as I will show you in this video. And the problem was even more acute, of course, in the early days of the hobby when there were so few people that were interested in it. And you know that finding a good game master really is key. A game is only as good as the game master, role-playing game, of course. Game masters can be mean, can be too adversarial, or too forgiving. They can be bad narrators. There can be a lot of things that can go wrong with a game master. So finding one was hard back then. Finding a good one was even harder, and still nowadays. Maybe a challenge. If your group loses a game master, then you know that all sorts of accommodations needs to be made. So I don't think it's any surprise that starting from the early days of role-playing gaming, they were people that were trying to come up with solutions to give you the role-playing experience without a game master. In this video, I'm going to discuss briefly three such games, three systems that allow you to play role-playing games by yourself, that is, without a game master, which also makes them solitaire friendly. So they're solitaire systems, but they also can be used as cooperative games, precisely because there isn't a game master that needs to overview things. So role-playing games that do not have a game master can be played solo. I'll talk about three of them. Before we go there, though, a thought. I've thought about theory about design in general. Now, what makes role-playing games unique, really, and that it's hard to do in board gaming, or at least that's not usually done, is the fact that in role-playing games, things can change thanks to the game master. The game master can abolish, suspend any rules, add new stuff, alter, bend, redirect the story, all to the advantage, hopefully, of the experience. The game master can change, add, and remove anything he or she wants so that the overall flow of the story is better, the experience is more interesting, the difficulty is right there, is challenging but not impossible. And we know that since the beginning of role-playing that was important. The book Shared Fantasy by Fine, it's a classic book, it's a sociological study of the early communities of role-playing games, and he already says that it was very common at the time to cheat so that the story could go well. That the game master would cheat, would just pretend to be rolling dice, and then would alter the effects of the dice as needed. Early editions of Dungeons and Dragons all tell you if the players come up with something that's not covered in the rules, make it up. And as a result, so since you have a human judge there that decides on the legitimacy of certain actions and the outcome of certain actions, then you have that wonderful, fantastic ability of the players of attempting potentially anything and everything. So you have a judge that can change rules, but thanks to that you have an endless degree of freedom for the players. Of course, role-playing games also have rules, but the difference is that in board games, everything is covered by the rules. The rules must cover every aspect of the game, must be finite, exhaustive, they must tell you everything and anything. As opposed to role-playing games in which the rules are part of the system. You can say, well, there's another rule that says you can break any rules so that it's still within the rules. I don't know, that doesn't sound convincing to me. There's still really something different in a game where the rules cover all cases that can happen, all actions that can be taken, and a game in which you can add around the allowed rules anything and everything, and the game master may in fact allow anything and everything. There should be that's a good starting point to get to where I want to go, which is when we have a game without a game master, and this is precisely what happens in all the systems that I'm going to show you, all the solitaire Gamemaster-less systems, when you remove the game master, then you also remove that discretionality that the game master has. You remove the ability for the game master to approve or change anything and everything, and you remove from the players the ability of attempting potentially anything. In all of these Gamemaster-less systems, of course, the rules must leave no ambiguities. The rules must tell you exactly what can be attempted and how and what is not possible. Because if you were let alone with a solitaire dungeon crawler, a solitaire role-playing game, fantasy role-playing game, dungeon crawler. You're by yourself and you're allowed to be your own game master. Then you can tell, well, my hero just received a visit from a powerful wizard that told him a spell that is nowhere in the books, but I just made it up, and the spell is teleport to where the treasure and the bad guy are. I use that spell, I teleport there, I defeat the guy with a single mighty blow. I win. The end. That doesn't sound like all that exciting. It's pretty boring adventure, and you can play thousands of those every day and have absolutely zero pleasure in doing it. So, games need obstacles. Games need obstacles for you to struggle against. A game master in a role-playing game provides assistance, support, and provides the obstacle because provides the world that you are interacting with. When you are playing a board game, then the rules provide the obstacles that you're facing. When you play a role-playing game solitaire, then you need to have a strict system of rules that you have to struggle with, or you have to struggle within the challenges presented by the rules. Rules should always be unambiguous and never force you to struggle against the rules themselves, but against the obstacles created by the rules. What I'm trying to say is, when you take a role-playing game and you make it solo-friendly, you make it Gamemaster-less, you need to remove all ambiguities. You need to create a system of rules that coincide with all that can be attempted, which is precisely what happens in board games. I guess my question is, do we really have solo role-playing games? Do solo Gamemaster-less role-playing games really exist? Or rather, aren't they structurally turned into board games when we remove the Game Master? That's my doubt. Maybe these systems can be marketed as role-playing games, but maybe they are board games with a strong RPG component, with a strong immersive element, with a degree of identification with the characters. But are they truly role-playing games when the system of the rules cover all possibilities and you'll find yourself in exactly the same type of situation as you find in a board game? That is the question. Now, back to us. As I mentioned, the history of solo Gamemaster-less role-playing games is almost as old as role-playing gaming itself. And here I'm going to show you, I'm going to mention an example. I don't have the copy with me, I just have a picture of some of the pages on my phone so I can read important parts. The oldest example that I know of Gamemaster-less solitaire role-playing game is from 1975. That's pretty early if you consider Dungeons & Dragons, the first role-playing game, was published in 1974. And guess who the author is? Gary Gygax, the man himself, the man that co-created Dungeons & Dragons, as far as I know, also created the first solo role-playing game. And he did that in the first issue, April 75, of the Strategic Review. The Strategic Review was a publication by TSR with articles and materials, expansions about the TSR products that were being marketed at the time. Started publications in 75, and in the first episode, the first issue of the Strategic Review, we find an article, or say a game, the instructions of a game that is called Solo Dungeon Adventures. If you Google it, Gygax Solo Dungeon Adventures, you will find the links, you may even find the text. And this is what Gygax himself writes in Solo Dungeon Adventures, when introducing what the heck are Solo Dungeon Adventures. Although it has been possible for enthusiasts to play solo games of Dungeons & Dragons by means of wilderness adventures, which means that early on people were using the board of Outdoors Survival, that was an Avalon Hill game, and the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons recommends that you use the board of that game to resolve wilderness adventures. So Gygax is telling us people early on were using that board and were using the random encounter tables of Dungeons & Dragons to play solo games. Very fascinating to me. Like in April 75, there was an habit, it was a tradition of playing role-playing games solitaire. For all who say, oh, that's a derivative form, it's silly, shouldn't be done, it was right there. And Gygax wanted to give you means to do so. In fact, Gygax says, although it has been possible up to this point, there has been no uniform method of dungeon exploring for the campaign, has here to 4 being required to design dungeon levels. So Gygax is telling us we need a way of creating dungeons. Through the following series of tables and considerable dice rolling, it is now possible to adventure alone through endless series of dungeon mazes. Now, this is very important. That's what Soul Dungeon Adventures is. It is a system of tables that you roll on to determine the configuration of the dungeon. You are in a tunnel, you roll to see if the tunnel turns one way or the other, or it ends, or there is a room. If there is a room, then you roll for the size of the room, the shape of the room, the number of doors in the room, the content of the room, and if there are monsters or treasures or traps, you negotiate them, you interact with those. Which sounds really fun. Then you can draw your dungeon as you go, you roll, etc., etc. There is no overall goal here. Gygax is not telling you at the end of the dungeon you need to defeat the monster, etc., etc., which is also in the spirit of the early Dungeons and Dragons, which was in fact about self-aggrandizing, developing your character rather than righting wrongs and having adventures driven by a final objective. However, Gygax himself is aware that just exploring rooms and generating monsters and treasures is not enough. It can get old very, very easily. That the beauty, the flavor of Dungeons & Dragons comes from the surprise that you have with strange rooms, strange encounters, mysteries, unexpected things. If you're just rolling from a table of things that you know, it's fun, you will have the fights, etc., etc., but it's not the same. It can grow old. And this is what Gygax says, continuing from where I stopped reading. After a time, I'm certain there will be some sameness to this. Just rolling and drawing and fighting monsters and collecting treasures. And for this reason, a system of exchange of sealed envelopes for special rooms and tricks or traps is urged. These envelopes can come from any other player and contain monsters or treasures, a whole complex of rooms, ancient artifacts, and so forth. I think this is incredibly fascinating. Gygax is suggesting that people write down contents of fun, strange rooms in envelopes and send them to each other. They exchange them. So as you're drawing your dungeon, you have an envelope that says open when you're at level 7. Then you find a chamber in level 7. You open it, read the text that tells you what's in there that is not in the table. That really tells us that some of the joy of role-playing games is discovery, is exploration, is finding new things, which, if you're just rolling on tables, that cannot happen. Here, however, we have almost like a prophecy or a very early design of some successful cooperative, solvable dungeon crawlers of the present days, such as you have in the Dungeons & Dragons board games, Wrath of Ashardalon, Legend of Drizzt, Temple of Elemental Evil, and so on and so forth, where you have decks of cards that may not all be used, so you have a degree of uncertainty, and that they create random events. And even those, after a while, of course, can get repetitive, but drawing cards that will come out in different combinations and will not all be used every time. And for the first couple of games, you may not systematically read every card, you may not get to know every card. Then it allows the game to feel fresh and young for longer. And even that, of course, after a while can grow old. But here's the idea. This is what Gygax is telling us, and it's a very smart, very insightful understanding of solo RPGs. You can have a system of tables that creates the environment, but you do need surprises. That must come from some text, must come from some content that is released by the game gradually, that is not all available to the players at the beginning. And this idea of like gradual release of content, gradual release of meaning, the design dispenses the story gradually, of course, is a key element for a story to have a true and strong narrative feel, to really feel like an experience, like you would have when reading a book or watching a movie, that you get to learn your stuff as you go. So right there, actually, you have a seminal idea of some modern successful soloable games, such as Shadows of Brimstone or Wrath of Ashardalon, that have precisely this. They have the geography, which is produced randomly in the games that I just mentioned by drawing tiles rather than to have to roll dice to draw. And then you have random elements generated, yes, by tables, but also by cards and other means of adding not just another monster, but adding variety, adding surprise. These two elements are really key. And I have to say, of course, Dungeons and Dragons, the Solo Dungeon Adventures don't have that. You have to provide it. The other systems, the other games that I want to mention that are Gamemaster-less role-playing games, if such a thing exists, you remember my question earlier, do not have a system of envelopes, do not have a system of gradual release of meaning. They could, one of them, but they just don't. And for this reason, they feel a little, they do feel a little weak to me. They do feel, they get old and samey quite fast. One is another game from 1975. There are two role-playing games that are Gamemaster-less from 75. That tells you how early people had this concern. And the game is being republished lately. The game is Garde, and here I have a modern edition. Garde is, to read from the introduction, a semi-historical game simulation representing many of the situations of an Errol Flynn movie set in the 17th or 18th centuries. So we have that kind of adventure, cape and spades, adventures that want to look good, to have lovers that fight in duels, that may join armies, and that are looking for. That's the point. I would expect these adventures to look for adventure, to look for exciting situations. Most of what these adventures do, however, is to try to increase their social status. That is one of the biggest things in the system. So actually, you're more often concerned with being seen around with the right people that may increase your social status, rather than going out and retrieve the necklace of the queen that has been stolen by the evil cardinal, etc., etc., etc. That's the kind of stuff they expected to find, and that's not what Garde is truly about. What is fascinating, though, is when the authors tell us about the origin of the game, which is the game was originally devised as a fencing system, so a combat game, a combat board game, a tactical war game in essence. Devised as a fencing system with background added to provide scenarios for the duels. After a time, it became apparent that the background was more fun than the duels, and Garde, in its present form, was born. Garde, as a role-playing game, developed in the same way as Dungeons and Dragons did, which is from miniature combat gaming, adding story to the point until the game became something else, became a game about the story with combat rather than a combat game with a background. The same thing here. But Garde was originally designed to be soloable and to be entirely cooperative, to be Gamemaster-less. So it developed from a combat game, story was added, but it remained a story that did not need a game master, and as such it is, again, in essence, a system of rules with a lot of random tables, with a lot of tables for random events, tables to resolve combat, tables to resolve your advancement in a military career. It's interlinked branching tree of tables. If I do this, I'll get to the table, which may get me to roll on that other table, etc., etc. As I said, the main thing here is to gain status and to advance your social level. The way the game works, if you have multiple players, the game is divided in days that are organized in weeks, so the week is, in a certain sense, the main turn. At the beginning of each new week, the players write down secretly what they're going to do every day of the week. Day 1, I'm gonna go to a club. Day 2, I'm gonna train with a certain weapon. Game 3, I'm gonna go gamble, etc., etc., etc. Before they do this, they can negotiate. For example, why don't we go together with the club so that people see you with me, and you have an higher status, so that helps me, and maybe then I'll do something for you. Again, this is the idea that being seen, going to the club with other people that are better than you is an advantage for you. And players write down secretly and then they reveal it. You can see this is the idea that has been done in gaming before. They reveal it. Of course, the decisions are not binding. Maybe I promise that I will come with the club with you, but I don't. And then you simply resolve the actions by rolling on the corresponding tables. Situations may arise where a duel may be called for. And here you have a little bit of a game masterish situation, because if a player challenges another to a duel, the community of players has to vote to decide whether there is sufficient cause. I like this. I like the fact that duels are truly not just between two people, but are a social event, as they used to be historically. And so basically the community has to make that call, and that is not strictly ingrained in tables or die rolls, etc., etc. But that's very little. In essence, this is a game where you create and aggrandize your adventurer, your social climbing adventurer, in a 16th, 17th century type of scenario, type of setting. I don't find this game super exciting. It's interesting for the original perspective, which is more of a biographical perspective rather than a single specific adventure, but also precise of this, it's an original thing, but precise of this, the game feels a little loose, it feels a little, well, it doesn't have a main goal that you grab and you have that satisfaction. You just keep becoming richer and more famous over time, and you decide when you have had enough of that. The last system for Gamemaster-less soloable role-playing games that I want to talk about today is a very recent one, just came out. So it's not even on Board Game Geek yet as of this filming. It is called Labyrinth. It is called Labyrinth, published by Chris Zimmerman. If you want to purchase it or want to have more information about the system, I think you just need to, the website is called labyrinthadventures.com. I'll look for a link. What is this? Well, guess what? It is a system that allows you to create your characters and then to a system to roll on tables to create your dungeon. So you roll to determine whether you're still in a passage, where you find a room, the type of room that you find, where things are located. So you simply draw rooms and tunnels as you go using these tables here. Random. So it's a randomly generated dungeon. And it is a dungeon in essence. So it's very similar to a solo dungeon adventure. So I don't know if there's a connection. It doesn't have to be. It's an idea that I see several people coming up with independently. But it is a much simpler system than So Dungeon Adventures. Gygax was still too much of a simulation is there. You have to roll for such details that really are not all that important. Here the idea is that if you determine the size of the room, which is say 6 squares, then you can give it whatever shape you want. Which is better, but you sort of like also you can exploit that system to create rooms that are say very long, and they'll allow you to get the dungeon in the direction where you want to go. So it is left to yourself. Well, I guess it's left to yourself to decide if you want to have a dungeon with really strange elongated rooms that allows you to have better chances of winning, or if you want to have more standard games with rectangular, square rooms, which is the way I did it, simply because of my love of tradition. So you have a system of tables to determine the configuration of the dungeon. You have 4 heroes that clearly, and the game is clearly inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. It is a simplified version of basic Dungeons and Dragons. You have 4 characters: the druids, the rogue, the warrior, and the wizard. The druid is the cleric. It's not even the druid in Dungeons and Dragons. It's just the cleric. The rogue is the thief, and the warrior and the wizards are their counterparts. Again, it's simplified. The combat system actually is more reminiscent of Wizard and Melee than it is of Dungeons and Dragons, but it's pretty basic. You have a stat for strength, a stat for dexterity, which can be modified based on what you're carrying, the armor that you have. You roll dice to determine if you hit, etc., etc. And when you do find a room in the randomly generated dungeon, you will find nothing, or monsters, or treasures, or monsters and treasures. The problem there is that that's all that you find, and so in essence the game, just like Gygax warned against, feels a little repetitive and bland after a while. The combat system is not tactically refined, so it's not that really there is all that interested in choosing interesting maneuvers. You can do that. I mean, that's one of the advantages of the Game Master. I can come up with creative maneuvers, so weaponizing the environment around me, and the Game Master will tell me if that makes sense and it can be done, and that is a creative approach. It's super fun. Or you can have a war game which is tactically more sophisticated. For example, Wizard and Melee, the combat you resolve it on a board, which is with hexagons, and it has so you can maneuver around, surround the opponent, etc., etc. Dark City Games published several new recent adventures based on that system, and they work like that. You have a story, which is choose your own adventure. You go through the paragraphs. When it's time to resolve a battle, you resolve it on a board. So the problem of this system, where you just roll to hit your opponents, and you can choose to run away. But as a wizard, you can choose which spells you want to cast. But other than that, it feels pretty bland, pretty straightforward and linear. It could be an introduction to wargaming for young players. Really, I see this as possibly useful to play with children, slightly older children. But when you get with teenagers, maybe there are more interesting things that you can do. So unfortunately, combat feels a little bland and a little uninteresting because you do not have the tactical aspect that you have in combat board games. You do not have the freedom that you have in role-playing games in a Game Master. It feels like a die roll fest. And again, just like as Gygax said, after a while, rolling on these tables feels a little samey, and you would want some new rooms, new things. And I hope that I would find that in one of the modules, one of the expansions for Labyrinth, which is called Labyrinth Quest, Enter the Labyrinth. I expected here to have a list of strange, mysterious, fascinating rooms with indications such as you're at the second level of the dungeon, the first room that you encounter ever, read that paragraph and you read the description. Then there are a couple of rooms that are random, and then the first room that you encounter, which has a size of 4, read this description, and then you have the content that you expect. The first room, which is south of certain things, the first room after this. You see, you could label the content of rooms in such a way that they get integrated in a randomly generated dungeon, and they give you variety. Some rooms are still randomly generated. Some other rooms, wow, you have the content you don't expect, and maybe you have a little bit of a choose your own adventure options. You want to open the chest, you want to interact with this or that environmental element in this or that way. So it could be done, and I hope it is. Unfortunately, it's not done in the first module. This is not what the module presents. What the module presents is it gives you a specific mission, so it's not all about looking for treasure. And there is an introduction. There is like a short story telling you the situation, and I'm like reading and waiting for the adventure to start. So, come on, come on, come on. Then the adventure starts, and what you find is simply these 5 semi-blank maps, each telling you where you start. You climb down the stairs and you get there, and this is the objective. Basically, this is the staircase to the next level. So I'm playing the traditional game with no added content until I get there, go down the dungeon. I start level 2, and again I build my dungeon randomly until I reach the objective, and you repeat like this for 5 levels. And I admit I didn't do that. I didn't play all 5 levels. I got a little bored by the sameness until you reach the end. And at the end you have, when you reach the end, you have a description, a confrontation. This is some content that is released not at the beginning of the adventure. You have the confrontation with the wizard, but it's just pretty much a description of the big bad guy that you are defeating. So it's not that the system to me is hopeless. Actually, I think this is a system that has great promise, as is from the basic system and from the first fairly disappointing module. The system falls in the type of trap that Gygax some 40 years ago had already warned us about, which is a system that does not require a game master, that will give you input, will create situations, requires another source of content which is not known at the beginning of the game. You have to pair that with random tables that generate events for the experience to really be fulfilling, to really be exciting, and to really have a strong narrative sense and give you the feeling of playing a role-playing game, something that you have when you play a role-playing game, and you're immersed in the story and you're enjoying the narrative and enjoying the type of progression. Well, this is what I had to say. I wanted to show some of these systems and share some ideas with you, hoping also maybe there are people out there that are considering creating their own solo or completely cooperative role-playing game. I hope you got some ideas here, some warnings. I'm not the first one to present these warnings, Gygax were aware of them. Some general ideas. So today we talked about Soul Dungeon Adventures and Garde and Labyrinth. They're all interesting. I found the three of them to be not super interesting, not super exciting. They're interesting from the point of view of design to me, from the point of view of the challenges, and even the limitations are, in a theoretical sense, interesting to me. As game experiences, I find all three of them a little too bland. I would still prefer to play a role-playing game with a human agent as a moderator, or with an AI that provides me with content such as I have in Legend of Dres, Shadows of Brainstorm, and so on and so forth. Good ideas there, but I think they could be refined, they could be put to better use, they could be improved by adding some content and some surprises in them.